Welcome to the Lazy but Smart Sinhala podcast. Learn to speak good enough Sinhala with a minimum needed effort.
Hello everyone and welcome to session 5 of the Lazy but Smart Sinhala podcast. I'm Dilshan, the guy helping you learn Sinhala. Hopefully it's working out. Hopefully you have picked up something. Hopefully I'm not the only one having fun on these sessions and you're enjoying it too. I don't have much of an update to give you since the last session, just because I recorded that only a few days ago. So nothing much has changed since then. Things are great. Things are going well. I'm happy. I'm enjoying these podcasts. So really no need for idle chit-chat and wasting time. Let's go straight into the session of today. Today's one is about nationality or your country. As you may have noticed, it is part of the self-introduction that we've been working on in the last couple of sessions. If you remember, I think, it was in session 2 where we did our first audio tutorial on greetings and responses, where we learned how to say hello in an informal context as well as in a formal context. Then in session 4, when we did our second audio tutorial, we learned how to introduce ourselves in Sinhala and also ask someone what their name was. And in this session today, we'll learn how to tell someone which country you're from and teach you how you could ask someone which country they are from. In this session, I use Sri Lanka as an example whenever I mention my country is or something like that. But don't worry, at the end of this session, I'll give you a link to a page where you can download a list of country names in Sinhala. I'll try to include as many countries as possible, so hopefully your country is also mentioned there. And if it's not, just leave a comment below and I'll continue to update that table so that everybody is happy. Okay? Alright, so I'll talk to you at the end of this session. If there's something that you don't understand during the session, note it down. I heard from some of you listeners out there that that's what you do, that you take down notes while listening. So if there are any questions, just leave them in the comment section at the end. But we'll talk about it when I come back. Okay, enjoy.
Feature segment.
As usual, let's start with a quick recap of what we saw in the previous session. We started off by looking at some basic possessives of the pronouns we saw. We saw that informal yo is oyage, his or her is eage, and my, which didn't follow the same rule, is mage. Then in section 2, we saw 2 ways how you could introduce yourself. The first method was to say my name is, and we learned how to say my name is Dilshan, and this was mage nama Dilshan. And then we went on to method 2 to introduce yourself, and this was just to say I am Dilshan, and this was mama Dilshan. In section 3, we learned how to ask what is your name, and we saw that we had to create a sentence that literally read your name what. And we created the sentence Oyage nama mokakda, where the word mokakda means what. And in the last section, I taught you how to be a little more polite by saying thank you. The Sinhala word was istuti, and we used that in order to say mama honding innawa istuti, which means I am fine, thank you, or honding innawa istuti, which means fine, thank you. Alright then, now let's look at what you'll learn in this session. Once again, I'll divide the entire session into 4 sections. So let me tell you what we'll do in each section. Section 1, I'll teach you how to ask someone which country he or she is from. And we'll do this by asking the Sinhala equivalent of what is your country. In section 2 and 3, I'll show you 2 ways of telling someone which country you are from. And method 1 would be to say the equivalent of my country is. And method 2 will be to say the equivalent of I am from. And in the final section, I'll show you a quick and simple technique to convert a statement into a question. And we'll use that to ask questions like, is your country, and the name of the country, of course, and are you from, and the name of the country. Let's start.
Section 1.
Asking someone which country he or she is from. Now, there are a couple of ways how you could ask someone which country they're from, but we're going to stick to the easiest and widely acceptable way of asking someone which country they're from. And that would be the equivalent of asking, what is your country? Now, if you remember, in session 4, we learned how to ask, what is your name? And if you remember, which I hope you do, the sentence was, Oyage nama mokakda. Oyage nama mokakda. Oyage meant your, nama was name, and mokakda was what. And literally, this sentence read as, your name what? Remember that we didn't use an equivalent for the word is since it was already implied. Now, similarly, coming back to the question we said before, which is, what is your country? We now know that we need to create a sentence that literally reads, your country what? And all we need to do is replace the word name with the word country. Now, once again, for the sentence, your country what? Your is oyage, what is mokakda. So the only thing you need to know is the singular word for the word country. And that word is another simple two-syllable word, which is rata. Rata. So if what is your name was oyage nama mokakda, what is your country is oyage rata mokakda. Oyage rata mokakda. Just by learning one new word, you already know how to ask a new sentence. Let's even go a bit further than that. If what is your country is oyage rata mokakda, let's now replace oyage with the other possessives that we've seen. Eyage rata mokakda will be what is his or her country. Mage rata mokakda will be what is my country. And Rikige rata mokakda will be what is Ricky's country.
Section 2.
Telling someone which country you are from. Let me show you the first method of saying which country you're from, and that would be the equivalent of saying my country is. Let's take me for an example. My country is Sri Lanka. Let's learn how to say my country is Sri Lanka. Now, at the end of this session, like I mentioned before, I'll give you a list of the country names in Sinhala from which you can choose the country that you're from. Let's go back to session 4 of the podcast, where we learned how to say, my name is Dilshan. Remember that example. The Sinhala equivalent for this sentence was, Mage nama Dilshan. And this literally read as, my name Dilshan. Once again, the word is was implied and we didn't use it. Similarly, to say my country is Sri Lanka, just like my name is Dilshan, we'll need to literally create a sentence that says my country Sri Lanka. You know that my is mage, country is rata, so mage rata means my country. All that's missing now for you is the Sinhala name for Sri Lanka. And the Sinhala name for Sri Lanka is not that far away, and that is Sri Lankava. We've just added a V at the end of Sri Lanka. Now, also notice that it's not Sri, although in English it's spelled with an SRI. In Sinhala, it's Sri Lankava. So, putting all this together, we know to create the literal sentence, my country Sri Lanka, we would say in Sinhala, Mage rata Sri Lankava. Mage rata Sri Lankava, which means my country is Sri Lanka. All right, let's pick another country. I'm going to go with England. England in Sinhala is Engalantaya. Engalantaya. By the way, you don't need to remember any of these country names. They'll all be on a list. And I don't think you need to know the names of the other countries besides yours and maybe Sri Lanka. Now, to say my country is England, we would say Mage rata Engalantaya. Mage rata Engalantaya. Good. Now, like we've done before, let's replace mage with all the other possessives that we've seen so far. So, mage rata Sri Lanka, as you know, means my country is Sri Lanka. Oyage rata Sri Lanka will be your country is Sri Lanka. Eage rata Sri Lanka will be his or her country is Sri Lanka. Very good. And Riki Gerata Sri Lanka will be Ricky's country, Sri Lanka.
Section 3.
In this section, we'll learn the second way of how you can tell which country you're from. In the previous one, we learned how to say, my country is Sri Lanka. And in this section, I'll teach you how to say, I am from Sri Lanka. Let's talk about the word from for a second. In spoken Sinhala, we don't often use a standalone word for the word from. Instead, what we do is we add an indicator to the end of the word that we're trying to say from. We saw an indicator in the previous session, which was the indicator ge, which indicated the possessive form of a pronoun. The same way, we use a different indicator in this case, and that indicator is n. N. You'll understand this when we see an example. Right, let's try to say from Sri Lanka. You already know that Sri Lanka in Sinhala is Sri Lankava. Now we're going to add the indicator N to the end of Sri Lankava. Since we're talking about two vowels here, for example, Sri Lankava ends with a and N begins with A, we're going to merge the two words and say Sri Lankaven. Sri Lankaven. Another example, you know that Engalante means England. And if we want to say from England, we add the N to the end of Engalante. So Engalante plus N becomes Engalantayen. Engalantayen. Another example, America in Sinhala is Americava. If we want to say from America, we add the indicator N to say Americaven. And the final example, Australia, for my Australian podcasters. I know there are a bunch of you out there. All right, so Australia in Sinhala is Australiava. And to say from Australia, we add N to the end of Australiava to say Australiaven. Now, I've given you 4 examples of country names. What were they? Sri Lankava, Engalantaya, Americava, and Australiava. Most Sinhala country names, I'd even say maybe 95% of them, and the only reason I'm saying 95% is because I can't identify the other 5%. I'm just leaving some room for doubt. Most of them end with either va, like Sri Lankava or Americava or Australiava, or they end with ya. For example, Engalantaya or Japanaya, which is Japan, or Chinaya, which is China. So essentially, whenever you add the indicator N to the end of a country name, most likely your final syllable will either be ven, like with Sri Lankaven, Americaven, Australiaven, or it will be yen. For example, Engalantayen, Japanayen, Chinayen. So when you're saying from and a country name, it's always going to either end with ven or yen. Right, so now we know that from Sri Lanka is Sri Lankaven. Now let's try to say, I am from Sri Lanka. We saw in session 4 when we learned how to introduce ourselves, I gave you the example of I am Dilshan, which in Sinhala was Mama Dilshan. Literally, this read as I Dilshan, where the word am was implied. So similarly, to create I am from Sri Lanka, the word am is going to be implied once again. So we literally need to construct a sentence that reads I from Sri Lanka. Now you see how easy this is getting. I, as you remember, is Mama. From Sri Lanka, you saw a few seconds ago, is Sri Lankaven. So, I am from Sri Lanka is Mama Sri Lankaven. And this literally reads, I from Sri Lanka. Let's do what we usually do. Let's substitute Mama with some of the other personal pronouns that we saw. For example, Oya Sri Lankaven means you are from Sri Lanka. Eya Sri Lankaven means he or she is from Sri Lanka. And Ricky Sri Lankaven means Ricky is from Sri Lanka.
Section 4.
Converting a statement into a question. In the 2 previous audio tutorials so far, I have introduced you to 2 question words. Do you remember what they were? The first one is what we saw in the first audio tutorial, and that word was kohomada, which meant how. And in the one just preceding this audio tutorial, I introduced you to the word mokakda, which meant what. You'll notice between the 2 words kohomada and mokakda, the last syllable of these words are the. So the reason I'm bringing this in right now is just because the trick to converting a statement into a question is also just to add the to the end of the sentence. It sounds too good to be true, but let me show you some examples. Right. Remember the sentence Oya honding innawa, which means you are fine. That's a positive statement. Now, if we want to convert this statement into a question, which makes you are fine into are you fine, all we need to do is just add the to the end of the Sinhala sentence. So the Sinhala sentence was Oya honding innawa, and we just add the to the end of this sentence and ask Oya honding innawada. Oya honding innawada, which means are you fine? Take another simple example. Remember this sentence, your name is Ricky. If you'll try to translate this with me, remember that this sentence was Oyage nama Ricky. Your name is Ricky. Now, if we want to change this into a question and ask, is your name Ricky? We just have to add the to the end of the Sinhala sentence, which is Oyage nama Rikida. Oyage nama Rikida, which means, is your name Ricky? Let's bring this back to asking about someone's country. We know that if you want to ask someone their country, you ask the equivalent of what is your country, which in Sinhala is Oyage rata mokakda. But if you sort of had a guess that someone's country was from, let's say, Sri Lanka, and you wanted to confirm that this person was from Sri Lanka, now in English we would ask, is your country Sri Lanka? Now let's see how we can ask that in Sinhala. Let's go in the same steps as we followed before. Let's first take the positive statement, which is your country is Sri Lanka, which will be Oyage rata Sri Lankava. Your country is Sri Lanka. And to convert this into the question in order to ask, is your country Sri Lanka? We just add the to the end of the Sinhala sentence. And that will make it ඔයාගේ රට ශ්‍රී ලංකාවද? ඔයාගේ රට ශ්‍රී ලංකාවද? Let's try one more example, and this time let's try to ask, is your country England? Remember that England in Sinhala is Engalantaya. Let's start with the positive statement, which is your country is England, and this in Sinhala would be ඔයාගේ රට එංගලන්තය. Why? Because your is ඔයාගේ, country is rata, and England is Engalantaya. ඔයාගේ රට එංගලන්තය. And now if we want to ask, is your country England? What do? We just add the to the end of the Sinhala sentence. And so ඔයාගේ රට එංගලන්තය becomes ඔයාගේ රට එංගලන්තයද. And that's it. One more session done.
And now a recap of this audio tutorial.
Okay, so let's quickly recap what we saw. We started off by learning how to ask someone which country that he or she is from. And I told you that there were a couple of ways of asking this, but the easiest would be to ask, what is your country? And the Sinhala equivalent was ඔයාගේ රට මොකක්ද, where rata is the word for country. Then we replaced ඔයාගේ with the other possessives that we saw, and we asked questions like එයාගේ රට මොකක්ද, which means what is his or her country, මගේ රට මොකක්ද, which means what is my country, and රිකීගේ රට මොකක්ද, which means what is Ricky's country. In section 2, I showed you the first way of how you could tell someone which country you are from. We took the example of saying, my country is Sri Lanka, and learned that this sentence in Sinhala is, mage rata Sri Lankava. We then replaced mage with the other possessives we saw, and we said, ඔයාගේ රට Sri Lankava, which means your country is Sri Lanka, and එයාගේ රට Sri Lankava, which means his or her country is Sri Lanka, and රිකීගේ රට Sri Lankava, which meant Ricky's country is Sri Lanka. In section 3, we learned how to say I am from Sri Lanka. And about the word from, I told you that in spoken Sinhala, we generally use an indicator N that we add to the end of the word. We took the example of the words from Sri Lanka, and we learned that the original name Sri Lankava, we added N to it, and we said Sri Lankaven. I also told you in a tip that most of the countries end with ver or year. So most likely when you say from and a country's name, the final syllable is most likely going to be ven, like Sri Lankaven, Amerikaven, or yen, like Japanayen or Engalantayen. And so we learnt to say I am from Sri Lanka, and that was Mama Sri Lankaven. And once again, we replaced Mama with the other personal pronouns that we have seen so far, and we said Oya Sri Lankaven, which means you are from Sri Lanka, or Ea Sri Lankaven, which means he or she is from Sri Lanka, and Ricky Sri Lankaven, which means Ricky is from Sri Lanka. In the final section, I showed you a quick and easy way to convert a statement into a question. And as an example, we learned how to ask, is your country Sri Lanka? And what we did is we took the positive statement, which is your country is Sri Lanka, which in Sinhala is ඔයාගේ රට Sri Lankava, and added the to the end of this Sinhala sentence to convert it into ඔයාගේ රට Sri Lankavada, which means, is your country Sri Lanka?
Sample dialogue.
Let's imagine a conversation between you and me. Let's say I meet you for the first time and I want to know what your name is. I would ask, ඔයාගේ නම මොකක්ද? ඔයාගේ නම මොකක්ද? Let's assume that your name is Jeremy. You would have two ways of replying. You would either say, Mage nama Jeremy, or Mama Jeremy. And then you can ask me if I am Ricky. Oya Rickyda. And since I'm not, I would say, Mama Dilshan. Or I could say, Mage nama Dilshan. Then I most likely might ask you about your country, and I'd like to know what it is. So I would ask, Oyage rata mokakda? And let's imagine that you're coming from America. You would have two ways of saying which country you're from. The first one would be Mage rata Amerikava, which means my country is America. Or you could say Mama Amerikaven, which means I am from America. Now let's assume that you have a friend called Jason, who is from Canada, and I wanted to know what country he's from. So I ask you, Jason gerata mokakda? And you could reply either Jason's country is Canada, or you could say Jason is from Canada. Jason's country is Canada would be Jason gerata Canadava, or Jason Canadaven, which means Jason is from Canada. Let's say I meet you at a later date and I want to inquire about Jason. I could ask Jason Kohomada, or we could use the little tip we learned to convert a statement into a question and ask Jason Honding Innavada, which means is Jason fine? To which you could reply, assuming Jason is fine, Jason Honding Innava Istuti, which means Jason is fine, thank you.
Questions and answers.
Question 1. How would you say the following word in Sinhala? Country. Rata. Question 2. How would you ask someone the following? What is your country? Oyage rata mokakda? Question 3. Try to guess the following words. From Sri Lanka. Note that the Sinhala name for Sri Lanka is Sri Lankava. Sri Lankaven. From Japan. Note that the Sinhala name for Japan is Japanaya. Japanayen. From Russia. Note that the Sinhala name for Russia is Rusiava. Rusiaven. Question 4. What do these phrases mean? Mage rata Chinaya. Here's a clue. Chinaya is the Sinhala name for China. The sentence once again is Mage rata Chinaya. My country is China. Ricky ge rata mokakda? What is Ricky's country? And your fifth and final question, how would you ask the following questions? Is she Anya? We first take the positive statement, which is she is Anya, translate this into Sinhala, which is Ea Anya, and we add the to the end of the sentence to ask Ea Anyada, which means is she Anya? Next phrase, is your name Tim? Once again, let's take the positive statement, your name is Tim, translate this into Sinhala, and that would be Oyage nama Tim. To convert this into a question, we'll just add the to the end of the sentence to ask Oyage nama Timda. And your final phrase is Tim from Sri Lanka? One more time, let's take the positive statement, which is Tim is from Sri Lanka. Translate this into Sinhala, which is Tim Sri Lanka when, and we add the to the end of the sentence to ask Tim Sri Lanka wenda. Great, that was session 5 of the podcast series. So like I mentioned before, there is a page to which you can go and download a list of country names where you can replace Sri Lanka or Sri Lanka, as you know now, with the name of your country. The page is lazybutSmartSinhala.com/session5, the number 5. Any questions that you may have jotted down, post them in the comment section and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. In the meantime, I'll say take care and talk to you on the next session. Bye-bye.
That was the Lazy But Smart Sinhala podcast. www.lazybutsmartsinhala.com. Goodbye.